Good afternoon. My name is Miguel Ampuero. I am a consultant with the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network in the Autism Initiative ABA supports. I'm very happy and very honored to have been invited to present this year at the National Autism Conference and share with you a topic that I'm very passionate about, share with you some of my work and research and practice, of course. As I mentioned on a topic that it's very, very important and critical in the education of our students with autism, which is the training of our paraeducators. Specifically, the training that occurs in the actual special education classroom. That is going to be that's what we're going to be most concerned with in this presentation. So the title of my presentation is presenting some effective and efficient strategies to prepare educators to deliver interventions in the special education classroom. Just to get us started, let me provide you with the mission of the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network. The mission of the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network is to provide or to support the efforts and initiatives of the Bureau of Special Education and to build the capacity of local educational agencies to serve students who receive special education services. With special emphasis on PDE, or the Pennsylvania Department of Education, commitment to the least restrictive environment, in that our goal for each child is to ensure individualized education program teams begin with the general education setting with the use of supplementary aids and services before they consider a more restrictive environment. So to provide you with an outline of this presentation, or what this presentation will attempt to address, again, as I mentioned before, we're going to be focused mainly on training practices for paraeducators. Training practices for paraeducators in the actual classroom, in the actual special education classroom, looking at the contingencies and dynamics in the special education classroom and determining what kinds of trainings may be most effective, and of course, considering a component of time efficiency or efficiency. But before we get there, we're gonna, I'm gonna begin by providing a brief overview about autism before diving into, looking at paraeducator practices, training, the trainings that have been provided, or what the literature has suggested as the trainings that they have received, the level of effectiveness, of course, and then evaluating efficiency of training and providing you with some possible strategies to perhaps increase the efficiency and maintain the effectiveness of training, followed by acceptability of those, training strategies, and wrapping up our session with some considerations of the topic or for the topic. So as we know, autism is a pervasive developmental disorder, which is characterized by impairments in some cases marked impairments in specific areas of functioning, such as social, or the development of social behavior, communication skills, and which are related to social skill development as well, and restrictive patterns and or behavioral restricted interests and or other behavioral patterns. So just over the last decade, the number of students who are receiving special education services under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, has drastically increased. And this is perhaps due to the behavioral challenges associated with students in need of special education services. In addition to that, due to these challenges, social and communicative needs of our students with autism, in most cases, they require highly specialized, technical, individualized interventions to be able to meet those challenges, or to meet those impairments, as well as to foster the generalization and acquisition of skills. And in most cases, of course, these interventions come from the science or derived from the principles of applied behavioral analysis. So luckily, interventions have been identified, effective treatments are available. However, there is not enough personnel or people adequately trained to be able to deliver these kinds of interventions across settings, which really fails to meet the demand. The number of students with disabilities or with autism continues to increase. However, the number of practitioners or people adequately trained to implement these specific strategies does not. What has been suggested is that in order for these interventions to not only foster the acquisition, but also the generalization of the skills acquired, these interventions must be delivered across relevant environments, such as the home environment, community, and of course, schools not being excluded. Considering that students spend the majority of their time in most cases, or in some cases in schools. When these interventions are actually implemented in schools, care educators at times are the ones who are in direct delivery or in charge of the direct delivery of these complex, individualized, specialized interventions. But who are paraeducators? Paraeducator support has been considered a critical component in meeting requirements for FERPA, or free and appropriate special education for students. Paraeducators have been identified with multiple terms, such as paraprofessionals, classroom assistants, instructional assistants, classroom aides, instructional aides, educational technicians, paratherapies, and perhaps in some other states, parapros. They are a group of individuals who work under the supervision of a special education teacher and or other special licensed personnel who is responsible for identifying learner needs in school settings. What does the law say about paraeducator support? So IDEA has stipulated that paraeducators who are adequately trained and appropriately trained may actually assist in the delivery of special education services for students with disability or students who are in need of special services. So our field, of course, is facing some critical issues, being, the absence, the critical shortages in special education teachers, which, this absence or this shortage of teachers may lead to the increased use of paraeducators in special education services or in the delivery of special education services, which in some cases may be seen as a cost-saving measure for school districts or school administrators. So as the number of students in need of special education services increases, the direct level of involvement between students and paraeducators in instruction actually also increase. So this rapid increase and the growing and pressing needs, and of course, considering also the critical issues that we're facing in our field, this has led the field to place paraeducators in a direct instructional role, given that the literature has suggested that behavior analytic principles and technology can be rapidly trained and acquired by non-certified personnel. Also, this rapid increase and changes, and the growing needs in the population of students with autism has also led the field to make changes in the responsibilities or shift the responsibilities slightly from support only to more instructional, not only in inclusive settings, but also in special education settings, which, with this shift, that also may suggest that that may not match really the training that our paraeducators have received. So what this means is that our paraeducators may have shifted from a specific type of role to another type of role without receiving adequate training, which of course is going to be reflected on outcomes in students. In addition to that, not only um, um, the rapid increase in the growing needs, the critical issues facing our field, but also due to that, peer educators are now perhaps practicing increasing higher, or with increased higher rates of independence due to professionals not having enough time to provide adequate supervision. So the topic of peer educator training has been really popular in the behavioral analytic and education research. So this research has explored the advantages of training peer educators and the impact that this training is likely to have not only in outcomes for students, but also in peer educators themselves. One thing that is clear that has been suggested is that without effective training, peer educator support is likely to not yield positive outcomes for students. Actually, their support may actually be detrimental to the social and academic development of our students. It has been also suggested that the training for peer educators needs to actually emphasize on very specific aspects. First of all, it must be effective. It must yield the outcomes intended. Number two, it needs to be efficient and practical. It must be something that can be done on a repeated basis or can be implemented on a repeated basis. It must be acceptable by those receiving the training, and it must be competency-based. We need to have goals and competencies associated with this kind of training. The methods used for training peer educators in most cases has included a combination of strategies or packaging of strategies. Antecedent-based strategies or proactive strategies, and also consequence-based strategies, or what we would call reactive strategies, which we'll proceed to evaluate now. As far as proactive strategies, again, these kinds of strategies occur prior performances. Any training that is received prior performance or prior observing target behavior. One of those strategies includes didactic instruction or training. So what is didactic training? It is a classroom-based, lecture-based model of instruction in which it is usually delivered to multiple individuals at once, in which the instructor or the lecturer employs what's called a verbal model of instruction. It's mainly talking and telling people, telling participants or the audience regarding a specific topic, aspects of a specific topic of interest. So in this specific case, group of trainees listening as an instructor is discussing a training topic. The main goal of this kind of training is to foster the acquisition of concepts. What about the content of these kinds of trainings? Well, we can really meet the individualized needs of every peer educator with this kind of training. That's why this training must be delivered to a group of individuals with the same, with shared experiences of interest, okay? So there has been a recent review of peer educators supporting students with ASD in classroom and the kind of trainings that they receive, which has supported this idea of, or has indicated this idea of didactic training being used when training peer educators. For instance, peer educators are receiving district in-service orientation trainings, which relates to policies perhaps, or brief introductions of the job to be performed, state professional development for peer educators, autism training or training related to specific characteristics of the diagnosis, some training regarding the application of behavioral principles, and inclusion training. No study that was evaluated in this review actually suggested that the training for peer educators included components related to the delivery of instruction or teaching of specific skills. So the use of didactic trainings was mainly to provide information, not to foster skill acquisition. The time commitment involved in the delivery of these kinds of trainings, of course, usually includes several hours and even the delivery of the training over the course of multiple days. So they can be really lengthy in content and time. So that is basically examples of what didactic training looks like, you know, like as if we would be in a traditional format of this conference, a presenter and an audience attending to the presentation. And the presenter, of course, delivering a specific topic of interest to the audience. That is exactly what it is, didactic training. So there's a presenter, there's an audience going over some specific content of interest. So what the research has suggested is that most training that occurs for peer educators occurs in this format, didactic, you know, or single event workshops. What's critical in this, what's critical to, well, what's a critical takeaway of this brief presentation of this specific format of training, it's that it's been suggested as minimally effective on the behavior of peer educators who work with students with ASD or other disabilities. Didactic training alone does not influence or is not effective enough to maintain newly acquired skills. So basically the point, you know, or our first point at this point in the presentation is that our peer educators, who in some cases work with the most challenging cases, are receiving training that is not effective, are receiving training that it does not pertain or does not relate to their classroom practices. We are focusing, you know, leaders in our field we are focused on information on general policies, introduction of job responsibilities. However, we are not developing concern for training our peer educators to actually implement or to training peer educators to acquire skills that are going to be relevant to their actual classroom practices. Point taken, we're employing ineffective or not so effective training strategies for peer educators that do not lead to skill acquisition, you know, and sadly, I mean, those are perhaps the most widely used strategies for training our peer educators supporting students with ASD. So again, to repeat point number one, didactic training alone does not yield good results in terms of skill acquisition, nor we are employing effective training strategies that are geared towards the acquisition of skills that are relevant to peer educator practices in the actual classroom. So with that said, of course, there have been other antecedent strategies that have been employed, such as the case of general case instructions or review of specific skills, modeling of skills that occurs prior, observation of performances, skill rehearsal, as well as multi-component strategies. Strategies or training approaches that have included didactic instructions, modeling, skills rehearsal, and of course, a component of feedback incorporated into this, you know, training approach. So when talking about performance feedback as a component of a specific training intervention, it is what we would call what it's called a consequence-based strategy. Performance feedback has been successfully used to increase the performance in a variety, the performance of individuals, of course, in a variety of organizational, educational, or human service settings. It has been considered, or it is considered the most widely researched method for increasing teacher and support staff implementation of targeted practices. It has been conceptualized as information provided by an agent regarding aspects of one's performance. Thus, of course, considering that it is a consequence of performance, feedback happening following a specific target observation or following a specific performance. It has also been defined as monitoring a behavior that is the focus of concern and providing feedback to the individual regarding that specific behavior. So for example, in school settings and or in other human service settings, feedback has been used to increase the treatment integrity of specific or prescribed interventions. What happens usually in feedback is that the consultant or somebody in the role of a trainer or a supervisory role, if we want to say, describe what's going well in implementation and what is actually going poorly, and as well as the strategies for improving implementation. So as I mentioned in feedback, we provide information regarding what somebody does, with respect to or related to a specific job or target behavior, and provide feedback regarding or information regarding the quality of what's being implemented, the steps of those, the steps implemented or included in implementation, the quantity of those, of the quantity of the skill being implemented, and of course, components of the quality of the process. Of course, when delivering feedback, we have to consider two very important considerations. Number one, when descriptive information and evaluative information are included in feedback, likely the peer educator or other staff member is going to learn how to perform in the future to gain supervisor or training approval. So feedback actually allows us to, in a way, pair with the individual, with the peer educator, showing them or training them or providing them with information as to how they're doing with respect to a specific performance allows us to become conditions as reinforcers for peer educators. And also, performance feedback should always include an explicit reference to the work performance of concern plus an evaluative summary of the work. So we have to make sure that we not only focus on the negative, we have to make sure that we establish those specific behaviors and reinforce specific behaviors that are components of correct implementation, as well as we provide descriptions and evaluations of those responses that need or that are in need of improvement. However, when considering, or as simple as it may seem, feedback is delivering feedback is not always very easy. And incorporating feedback into an intervention, a training intervention, warrants careful consideration, of course. We need to consider the method of feedback that we're going to be employing. Am I going to be using vocal verbal feedback, which is usually the most traditional way to deliver feedback, in which I basically tell someone, by using vocal verbal behavior, aspects of their implementation. Feedback can also take the form of written or typed, and nowadays, of course, feedback can be delivered through email. We can always use graphical components, graphical feedback, in which a graph indicative of the peer educator performance can be explained, and in most occasions, this type of feedback, as well as, a written feedback, is done in combination with other methods of feedback, such as vocal verbal. Technology-based types of feedback can also be used. For instance, the use of specific technologies that may allow for feedback delivery, as well as consider other components that are important or critical in implementation, or that may affect implementation, such as observer reactivity, perhaps. So not only considering how we're going to deliver feedback, whether it's going to be a single component feedback or a combination of feedback strategies or methods of delivery, but also, am I going to consider delivering feedback in vivo? Is it going to be done within the session as performances are actually occurring? Or is it going to focus, or is it going to be following the observation? You know? So when thinking about delivering feedback in vivo as behavioral performances occur, we also need to consider, as I already mentioned, this component of observer reactivity and how that actually may impact the performance of the individual being observed, or the individual whose performance is actually being evaluated. In this case, our peer educators. So that is something to consider. So how is the temporal location of feedback going to influence the behavior, the instructional behavior of my peer educators? You know? Or if waiting until the end of the session is going to have the same impact on behavior, or the behaviors that I'm willing to strengthen or wanting to strengthen are going to have the same impact on those behaviors if I wait a little longer to the end of the session. Again, as mentioned, feedback has been considered the most effective strategy for improving implementation fidelity. Actually, it has also been considered a critical component in adult professional development. The What Works Clearinghouse, standards for single case design, and of course the literature based around performance feedback has suggested feedback or performance feedback as a consequence-based strategy for training being number one, an evidence-based strategy, and number two, it is supported with strong to moderate evidence. So in our consideration of the importance of performance feedback in increasing or improving implementation fidelity of targeted practices, a critical component in adult professional development, being an evidence-based practice, being moderate to really strong effects as an intervention for changing people's behavior, staff's behavior, it is critical to consider this point. Feedback should be considered when creating and designing training programs for peer educators supporting students with ASD and other disabilities. We must always, as the ones who design and consider strategies in our training approaches, specific strategies of training approaches, we must consider performance feedback. So our point number two is going to be performance feedback must be included in all training programs for our para educators. So as mentioned, when considering training interventions for our para educators, you know, the idea that didactic trainings may not be so effective at establishing and maintaining specific instructional behaviors, and also the importance of performance feedback in you know, when added to specific approaches that are antecedent based or proactive in nature. We're looking at training strategies that focus on the development of skills, which is really what we're concerned here, which is really the important consideration here when designing training interventions for our peer educators. We are concerned here with developing skills that are going to be relevant for our peer educators in their actual practices in the classroom, when actually working with the students. What are the skills that are necessary? So we need to focus on skill building, skill teaching, rather than just simply providing information regarding those skills to our peer educators. So performance and competency-based training has been instrumental in establishing and maintaining high procedural fidelity among individuals. It is also called, or it is what we would call on-the-job training, which is really focused, as I mentioned, on skill development. You know, this is the kind of training that really our trainees or our peer educators are going to get the most from. Trainings may derive little benefit from trainers' verbal knowledge unless that knowledge is translated into action or service. So here what we want is we want to make sure that they practice the skills that are going to be necessary for their instructional practices in the classroom. So specifically, we're looking at specific components of training packages that are going to be most beneficial when training our paraeducators, supporting students with ASD. So Reed and colleagues have suggested steps of prototypical paraeducator training programs that are also considered evidence-based. So for instance, first of all, an identification of the specific work skills to be taught, or the specific relevant skills, and specifying them, identifying and specifying those specific skills to our paraeducators. Provide our paraeducators with written summaries of work skills specified in our step 1, specified and identified. Verbally describe the work skills along with the rationale for targeting those specific skills. So it is not only about telling our paraeducators what they're going to be teaching, but also why they are going to be teaching specific skills, or why specific procedures need to be employed. Physically demonstrating the work skill for the paraeducator. So it is not only about telling them, but also showing them what they need to do. Step number 5 would actually include observing the paraeducator practicing the targeted work skill. So as you identify and specify work target skills, provide written summaries and explanations as to the what and the why of the skill that they're supposed to be teaching, or they're going to be teaching, demonstrating the skill, observing their practice, and of course, following that, providing supportive or corrective feedback based on that implementation, in order to shape up those specific performance. And of course, continuing with steps 4, 5, and 6 until a specific criteria for implementation or mastery criterion has been actually reached. So it is not so much. So when we're thinking about this specific training program, we're not so much talking about, okay, so I'm just going to show you or tell you about it and about the skill that you're supposed to be teaching, explain it to you, model, rehearse it. So I'm going to watch you rehearse it, give you some feedback, and then done deal. We also have to make sure that we continue the training program until training mastery or mastery of a specific target skill has actually been achieved. So if we're talking about evidence-based training that includes all of those components, we are going to basically be talking about behavioral skills training, or as most of us would actually know it as BST, which is an empirically behaviorally oriented teaching method that focuses on individual acquisition of skills. So behavioral skills training focuses on skill acquisition. It is firmly based on the principles of applied behavior analysis. Reinforcement contingencies, of course, are in place. It is frequently used to teach skills across individuals, across disciplines. And of course, it has been also used not only with as a training method for professionals or paraeducators or staff, support staff, but also it has been used to train individuals with ASD to implement specific target performances. It is a training package, a multi-component approach that is combined or that, composed of antecedent or proactive strategies as well as consequence-based strategies such as performance feedback. As I mentioned, it can serve to teach a wide variety of skill. Any skill that you can teach, you can actually teach it using this specific training package. Now, this is a very important component when considering feedback. When considering BST. It is a highly scripted procedure. Okay. We may have heard and even implemented behavioral skills training loosely, accounting for the specific components in the training. However, it goes beyond that. When talking about behavioral skills training, we're talking about a highly scripted procedure or training approach, training model, where every single step in the implementation of the training strategy or training procedure, instruction review, identification, structure and review, explanation, modeling, rehearsal, and feedback, must follow certain guidelines, must be scripted. There is, of course, a lot of research supporting the effectiveness of behavioral skills training in a variety of settings and to teach a variety of skills. So for example, Matsarova and Sturmy in 2012, they trained using behavioral skills training peer educators to implement man training. Nigrobruzzi and Sturmy also taught MANs to staff so that they could teach those MANs to, or deliver man training to students with autism. Zirikov and Sturmy, in both of their studies, they implemented behavioral skills training to establish discrete trial instruction or discrete trial training procedures with teachers and peer educators. Lavi and Sturmy actually implemented behavioral skills training to teach or train support staff on the delivery of preference assessment. Rosales and colleagues in 2009, the use of PECs with peer educators and teachers. Navayama and Sturmy in 2010 trained support staff on safe and correct staff guarding and ambulation distance for students with multiple disabilities. Moore and colleagues, procedures for conducting functional analysis. So as we can see, it's a really versatile training approach, multi-component, evidence-based, that it's focused, again, on the actual acquisition of skills rather than just simply explaining and providing information to our paraeducators regarding specific performances. Brock and colleagues in 2017 actually conducted a meta-analysis of studies that evaluated BST with teachers. So 118 single case study designs were evaluated. And what the authors suggested here was that BST was associated with the most consistent improvement of implementation fidelity. However, so we know all of this about BST as being evidence-based, as being effective, as focusing on specific skills that are going to be relevant for our peer educators in their implementation in actual classrooms. It accounts for multiple steps, so we are really ensuring the effectiveness of training by explaining rationales, providing steps, modeling the skills, watching practice, providing feedback, and ensuring mastery, of course, prior actual implementation with actual students. However, it is yet not consistently implemented in schools. And I believe that probably deserves a little bit of thought. So I would ask you to please take a second to consider why this is not happening. So why is BST so effective, yet not consistently implemented in school settings? As we're gonna see a little bit later, of course, the implementation of BST, as effective as it is, of course, it poses some disadvantages, which perhaps may be associated with the why BST being such an effective training strategy, it is not frequently implemented in schools when training our paraeducators. Now, when using behavioral skills training as a training strategy, of course, we have to consider, number one, what is the specific target behavior to provide training to our paraeducators. So we have to operationally define what correct performance looks like in observable and measurable terms, so we can actually keep data on it. You know, in order to do that, we can use a task analysis, which clearly specifies and sequence procedures that are to be trained, chain and shape paraeducators' performance, you know, as it is observed through the use of feedback, and perhaps other means of positive reinforcement. Identify SDs and terminal outcomes. What are going to be specific stimuli that will signal that reinforcement will be available based on implementation? using a storyboard is critical. And as using the storyboard, with that, I want to relate it to this specific approach being scripted. With using a storyboard, it's basically your roadmap as to how implementation of the training strategy is actually going to be delivered. You know, how is your rationale going to be implemented, or what is it going to include? Even what words it's going to be included in your rationale. What instructions will look like? How will performance be modeled? Will it be modeled live? Will it be modeled via video? How many practice opportunities? How is that going to occur? How is feedback going to be delivered? Taking you back a little bit to the methods of feedback that we needed to consider. Is it going to be a single method of delivery? Is it going to be verbal only, or is it going to be verbal in combination with written feedback, or graphical feedback, or technology-based feedback? Also considering the temporal location of feedback. Am I going to be delivering feedback as the performance is being, as behavior is actually occurring, or instructional behavior is actually occurring, or is feedback going to be delivered as following the observation once the paraeducator has actually completed implementation? And of course, we are going to continue skill practice with antecedent and consequent strategies until fluency has reached, or until a specific training criterion has been met. What is very important to consider when delivering behavioral skills training is that, or when implementing or using behavioral skills training as a training approach, is that usually mastery must be reached prior the participant or the individual can actually implement the target behavior, the target skill, the target practice with the actual learner in the natural environment. So what are the components in behavioral skills training? Well, as I already mentioned, as we went over, the basic components of BST include instructions or review, modeling, skill rehearsal, and performance feedback. Instructions. What are instructions in this specific case or in the context of BST? Basically, providing the individual with clear instructions as to what the target behavior is and what it's not. You know, how we are defining, operationally defining our target behavior, our target practice, our prompting procedure, if you want to call it. Specific target behavior set for acquisition. And of course, as I mentioned, we must define it in ways that we can observe it and we can measure it, you know, so that we can actually provide feedback as well as feedback regarding implementation of those specific measures. The rationale for the importance of the skill being trained, of course, is important, as I already mentioned. We have to make sure that we provide not only the what is that we're going to be training, but also why the specific importance and the why we're actually employing or receiving training on a specific target skill. In order to do that, we could use multiple models. It could be simply typed instructions that, you know, with operational definitions of all of the target behaviors. We can use performance checklists as well. So for example, what we have in this slide is a clear description of all the components included in our implementation. So for example, Sturtson and Carr in 2012 provided this specific model for target behavior definitions or instructions that accounted for organization of data materials or data sources or data materials. Materials presented correctly. What does that look? How does that look? What does that look like? You know, what does it look like in terms of every single component of implementation or aspect of implementation? How to actually do, or what does it look like in the specific case of Sturtson and Carr, you know, to secure child's attention? What does that look like? What is the operational definition of securing adults' attention? What does it mean to deliver appropriate instruction? You know, what words do you use? what are the expected responses, et cetera, et cetera. So for instance, this is an example of a performance checklist, which not only task analyzes or provides a broken down a view of all the components included in implementation, but also specific definitions. So for instance, this is a procedural checklist or performance checklist related to a classroom schedule, implementation of classroom schedule procedures. So whether the schedule is actually in a central location, what does it mean to be visible by staff? Does it specify all staff members? So basically all of the components in implementation or the implementation of this specific procedure are included with clear definitions as to what it is and what is not. Providing succinct and written descriptions of the target skill. What is it that we're supposed to do here? Clearly, in writing. Provide each trainee with a written description of the target behaviors that constitute the skill. And of course, in this case, the checklist can also serve this function. So what we have in front of us is just an example of a written description of procedures included in implementation of a multiple stimulus preference assessment without replacement. Beginning, the session with specific procedures. At the start of the session, this is what we do. This is what the therapist must do. This is how we respond once the student has made a selection. What happens if the student makes an error? What happens if the student chooses A or B? And how do we proceed until the procedure is actually concluded? Very clear in a step-like fashion procedures so that the participant also has a reference for implementation. If possible, not only provide these kinds of resources to our paraeducators, but also review and describe these sources, these instructions and definitions with them, prior implementation of additional antecedent strategies. So sit down with them, go over these specific procedures with them so that they have an opportunity to also ask questions, perhaps if doubts arise or they have comments or questions regarding specific definitions of target behaviors. Modeling the skill, a very critical component. When we model the skill, we're basically role-playing the interaction. We're showing them how to perform the skill, the target behavior. Role plays interaction between teacher and training and or paraeducator. And we're going to discuss a little bit later the role of the teacher in this idea of training. It's usually done prior performance or it is an antecedent strategy. May need modeling several times prior you actually involved in rehearsal. And all of these specifics of your modeling stages of the training need to be clearly specified in your storyboard. Also involves explanations of the model skill. So it doesn't mean that you're just simply going to show the skill and not say anything. You also provide explanations as to the specifics of the target skill. Of course, modeling is based on observational learning. And as you can actually provide demonstrations of skill performance live, in person, you can also use video models, which has been suggested to have some effectiveness or be as effective, show some effectiveness in this training process. Very important, you have to be a competent performer. If you are not so competent in the implementation of the targeted practice, you're modeling the wrong skill, so that's something that you certainly do not want for your paraeducators. If you're not a competent performer, do not model the skill. It will foster the rehearsal of an incorrect skill, as I already mentioned. It will end up shaping incorrect behavioral performances. Only model skills that you're competent to perform or competent to provide training on. In some cases, this is probably one of the components that does not really become, is not accounted for. We assume that we know correct implementation of certain practices. However, we are not able to uh, uh, competently perform those specific practices to fidelity, thus, of course, misguiding the behavior of our peer educators. So make sure that you're a competent performer and that you have the adequate training to um, demonstrate the skill and also train on the skill. Rehearsal. So as important as the other components, this is perhaps where we have to spend the most amount of time with. We model the skill, we have provided rationales, or going in order, provide rationales, explanations, clarifications, model the skill. Now it is the time for our paraeducators to practice the skill. This is a critical feature in our training. This is a critical component in behavioral skills training. You model the skill, now they practice, and practice, and practice. And you provide practice opportunities to the trainee in which the trainee practices the target skill. And of course, specific variations of the target skill as determined. It is usually done in combination with feedback. So as the participant is practicing the skill, or as the learner, as our peer educators are practicing the skill, we also have to account for delivering feedback, immediate feedback following their performances. And of course, it is not one trial. I mean, there may be learners, peer educators that are one trial learners. However, we must account clearly in our training storyboard how many opportunities are we going to provide for skill rehearsal. And that is dependent, of course, on many different factors, time, resources, et cetera, But you must account when considering skill rehearsal for multiple opportunities for the paraeducator to practice the skill, the relevant skill, and for frequent feedback to be delivered. Performance feedback, as I already mentioned. Once you have provided the rationales, model the skill, provided the opportunity to practice the skill, again, done in combination with rehearsal, you provide performance feedback to the trainee as they practice the performing skill, the target skill. So provide individualized, supportive, and corrective feedback. So again, our feedback should not just focus on the wrong aspect of implementation or the incorrect aspect of implementation. We also need to strengthen those things that are actually going right, And also, when considering feedback, we want to make sure that we remember our ratio of positive to negatives. We don't want to be too positive that we don't even account the negatives, nor we want to only account for the negatives and not even, acknowledge all of the great things that our peer educators are doing, in regards to the implementation of the target skill. So we want to keep a balanced ratio of positive and negatives. And of course, when delivering our negatives, we want to make sure that the negatives are evaluative and descriptive. And of course, keeping your evaluation to what's sufficient to indicate that specific target skills need improvement, and then proceed to the descriptive aspect of this, which is tell the participant how to do it correctly, and then provide, of course, opportunities for practice. I think that is critical, specifically when delivering feedback. We must accompany feedback with an opportunity to practice the skill so they have the opportunity to do it correctly so that positive reinforcement can be delivered. So for instance, what we have in front of us is, what we could consider a feedback guide, which actually provides us with the, type of feedback, what is it, and when should we use it? So for example, vocal feedback, delivering vocal feedback about performance to the supervisee, when should I use it? After a performance, in situ, or in a specific training facility or training setting. Written feedback, providing supervisee with notes from observations, after a performance or in a meeting, something that that could also be reviewed with our peer educators. Model feedback, modeling the correct behavior for the supervisee, following observation and feedback already. Video feedback, showing the supervisor a video of his or her performance and reviewing it, of course, and that can be done in a meeting setting. Graphic feedback, providing the supervisor with a graphic display of their performance, showing whether their performance over time is actually changing, you know. Self-monitored feedback, formal feedback, informal feedback, all of these forms of feedback can be considered, and of course, the appropriate time to use it. And as I mentioned already, not only considering what kind of feedback, but also other details related to feedback, such as the temporal location of feedback, as well as discussed already, the method of delivery. So what about delayed feedback? I think it provides with an option, you know, for continued training, but that delayed feedback really doesn't mean waiting post, post performance, or waiting for a period of time post performance before feedback is delivered. It is basically feedback being delivered through video, or better explained, based on a video of the participant's performance, which of course has advantages and disadvantages. So basically, I videotape a specific performance, and perhaps I don't have the necessary time to provide feedback right in the moment following a performance. So I can take the recording and then watch it later with my peer educator and provide specific feedback. In some cases, as I said, it has advantages, such as it provides us with an option of delivering feedback specific to a specific performance. The downside to it is that it may require additional resources. Another advantage of delayed feedback could be that it allows us to really capture additional components of implementation that we may have not been able to capture during the live observation. So, it's something to consider, an application of feedback in this model of training that could be really beneficial, but again, it may actually have, of course, some limitations specifically with respect to resources. Again, it does not mean that we're just going to wait a period of time following performance to give feedback, which has been considered and established as highly ineffective. Feedback has most positive impact on performance when it immediately follows it. Our last step in behavioral skills training, of course, is going to include repeating steps 4 and 5, skill rehearsal and feedback, until mastery or a mastery criterion has actually been reached. Trainees should establish a mastery criterion, such as trainees performing at 100% or performing to a specific number of skills of the target behavior, or certain steps with 100% proficiency. This is sometimes prior implementation with students, as I already mentioned. Once the participant or the peer educator has actually reached training mastery, then they must perform it in vivo. They must be able to perform the skill, or they should be given the opportunity to perform the skill in the natural environment with the actual client or student. So us as trainers, we need to make sure that we follow up in vivo. But this, the advantage of this is that we actually get to observe the real application of the procedure within the natural contingencies of implementation, or within the natural dynamics of implementation. It is likely to increase the likelihood of generalization of the skill. It's an opportunity for on-the-job supportive and corrective feedback. So the feedback actually continues post-training. And of course, we must make an attempt to continue performance management and training. So as we have collected data during training, we must continue, and most importantly, continue to collect data post-training when the skill is actually being implemented in natural settings with the actual clients or with the actual students to see whether the skill is actually being maintained. And if the skill is not being, if the skill is not being maintained, then make the necessary adjustments to our training procedures so that the peer educator can continue performing the skill to optimal levels of implementation fidelity. So this is an example of a storyboard in BST, so which clearly outlines every single step in our training sequence. What is, it clearly specifies specific aspects of implementation. What is the performance? What is the objective to be trained? The rationale of it. This is exactly what we're going to provide to the trainee, to our peer educators. Why is this performance important for both the organization, the school, the student? Instructions. What information or instruction does the trainee need to know before you actually begin other implementation of other strategies or training strategies or the antecedent strategies, perhaps modeling the skill? Is there any background information that the individual or the peer educator needs to know about the learner, perhaps? Modeling, what is it that you're gonna do? What are you gonna say? So for example, using a task analysis as a guide, you write out exactly what you will do to model the performance for the trainee. What examples and non-examples will you model or show? Will you model the performance directly or use simulation or video? So all of these components need to be accounted for. What is it that you're gonna say during modeling? What explanations are you going to provide during modeling? Practice. How will the performance will practice the performance? Are they gonna practice it live? Are they gonna, they may practice with you? Are they just gonna practice without a fake student per se, if you want to call it? How difficult is it going to be? Is it going to be just basic, or is it going to account for specific situations, which also relates to modeling, specific situations that may actually vary in implementation, accounting for all of those? What feedback will you provide if performers are doing well? What feedback will you provide if performers are not doing well? How are you going to evaluate this? And of course, evaluation of the delivery systems. So what I've attempted is to provide you with an overview of how behavioral skills training should actually be delivered. And of course, there is a wide variety of ways in which behavioral skills training has been implemented. However, there are some specific components that really need to stay in place so we assure the effectiveness or ensure the effectiveness of the training procedure. Again, it is scripted. Sometimes it is implemented loosely. Sometimes it is implemented without specific components, such as follow-up, that actually may not really provide us with the information that we need to best support our peer educators in the acquisition of skills, and not only the acquisition of skills, but also the maintenance of skills, or just simply skills that are relevant to their practices. But what are some of the VST advantages? There is evidence of effectiveness across settings. So we can implement VST pretty much. We can train anyone across any setting to implement any specific skill in educational settings, human service, clinical, residential, industrial, educational, as already mentioned. It really focuses on skills to practice in the actual job setting. So for our peer educators, with the shift in roles and responsibilities, it will provide them with an opportunity to become trained and skilled in the skills that they will use on a consistent basis in their classroom practices, in their instructional procedures, in the things that are going to, the procedures that are going to help our students actually acquire the skills that they need. Eliminate concerns regarding generalization of skills, of course. It may involve, but what are some of those disadvantages? As we have advantages, we also have some disadvantages. It may involve the training of only one staff member at a time, okay? Which also may be difficult to implement due to the real interfering conditions of a natural setting, you know, in a classroom. Considering that, you know, ratios are complex in some cases and teachers have a load of 12 students, how do I take care of all of my 12 students and also be on top of their data systems and the evaluation of progress, for progress monitoring for skill acquisition for my students, but also account for the training of my paraeducators and considering data systems to monitor the acquisition of skills and maintenance of skills of my paraeducators' instructional behaviors. So those may be some disadvantages of BST, being that you may only train one person and it may be a little chaotic or a little difficult to implement in a classroom considering, you know, real life situations in our classrooms or like real classroom dynamics or contingencies in natural settings. So what does the research say with respect to VST and paraeducators? So there is some research that specifically has evaluated the effect of VST with paraeducators supporting students with ASD in actual school settings. So for instance, Ledford and colleagues in 2017 effectively trained paraeducators to increase social interaction skills to students with autism, interactions with their peers during group instruction. Based on this training or following this training, paraeducators included in this study were able to implement procedures included for training or selected for training at 100, you know, with 100% implementation fidelity. Specifically in this study, the authors or the researchers used instructions, modeling, skill rehearsal, and feedback, and with performance feedback actually being delivered in session following, immediately following performances and also post-session feedback. Lavi and Sturmy in 2002 also successfully trained paraeducators when training them to implement procedures associated with the delivery of multiple stimuli preference assessment without replacement. These paraeducators or the paraeducators in this study also work with students with autism. As in the case of the Ledford study, Lavi and Sturmy also use instruction modeling, but in this case, they use video modeling as a form of modeling, skill rehearsal, and feedback. What the author suggested was that training sessions length was between 30 and 40 minutes, and training mastery criteria will average 4 to 6 sessions. Similarly, Niger-Bruzzi and Sturmy in 2010 trained paraeducators to implement or to deliver demand training to students with autism. Similarly, they use instruction modeling, rehearsal, and feedback as their sequence of training or the specific components in the training strategy or the training approach. In this specific study, mastery was reached after an average of 3 to 4 sessions across participants, and training length lasted between 30 and 40 minutes, 30 and 60 minutes, excuse me. So I am going to show you now some videos of what this may actually look like in practice.
What is it?
Like.
Way to go.
In order to make sure that programs are delivered with fidelity, it is so important that we adequately train staff.
She touched the kitty, but also touched something else. Okay. So you want to be careful and make sure that if it's kitty, it's the kitty only that I want you to select.
We need staff training that involves ongoing work in classrooms in which teachers are provided models of what they are to do, are allowed to practice that skill, and are given ongoing feedback on their performance.
Keep on.
Show me the cookies. Touch the bed. What is it?
Basketball.
What is it?
Bird. That's it.
Our goal is to make teaching explicit, exact, so that we can give meaningful feedback to teachers.
So when we're presenting it to Montana too, when he's using his book,
The morning meeting provides an excellent opportunity to train staff on specific instructional needs for the students in the classroom.
When I showed him the time for tea, he said, sit.
There are multiple layers of staff training. We need to make sure that we are providing teachers and instructors with ongoing support.
It's okay to emphasize the M because that's where the problem is.
Okay.
We have the guidance of a board certified behavior analyst, as well as a consultant, and then the internal coach. And the internal coach is the link between the consultant and the classroom teacher.
The teachers, in turn, work to make sure that all adults providing instruction within the classroom have the procedures mastered and are able to deliver them with integrity.
It really provides very systematic support, breaks it down into very manageable levels, lots of good feedback, and a high level of expertise from our consultants. I can't stress that enough.
Good staff training empowers teachers. Invariably, teachers love receiving training that makes them better teachers because in the long run, teachers are happier when they are getting good outcomes from the students they serve. For more information, visit the patent website.
What I will show you now is a couple of additional videos that directly show the implementation of behavioral skills training, or BST, on a variety of skills.
Behavioral skills training, or BST, is a procedure for teaching new skills. BST is a useful tool for training adult learners and is a required procedure of supervision. The four initial components of BST are as follows: introduction of the skill, skill demonstration, opportunity to practice, feedback. Skill demonstration, opportunity to practice, and feedback are repeated until mastery is observed. Here, a supervisor is using BST procedures to teach a supervisee to conduct a multiple stimuli without replacement preference assessment.
Preference assessment procedure called multiple stimuli without replacement, abbreviated MSWO. You may have seen others do this assessment or attempted to do this yourself in the past, but today I want to solidify your skills by teaching you the exact steps so that you may conduct it fluidly with clients.
Okay, sounds good.
As you are already aware, preference assessments are an essential first step for any reinforcement contingency or teaching procedure. Here I have all the steps for the MSWO procedure. There is also a copy of the data sheet with instructions. I'm going to demonstrate these steps and then we will practice together. For right now, take a minute to read over the procedural checklist and the data sheet.
Here, the supervisor gives the supervisee a copy of the procedural checklist. It contains all the steps of the preference assessment. The checklist will also be used to provide the supervisee with feedback following rehearsal. If you have a copy of the multiple stimuli without replacement procedural checklist available, follow along with the demonstration.
Now I would like to model the preference assessment for you. I will also be taking data using the data sheet as we go. Can you be the client and I will be the therapist?
Sure. Do you want me to just make random choices?
Yes, that will be fine. Now I will start by presenting all of the items to my client individually for 30 seconds. Look. My turn. Brown dinosaur. Pick one.
Okay, so you just want me to pick one?
My turn. Pick one.
After a few typical trials, the supervisor will demonstrate how to handle alternative client responses.
This time, I want you to select 2 items simultaneously. I will block access and reinitiate the trial. Pick one. Pick one. My turn? Finally, I want you to pick up an item and then pick up another item with your other hand. I will take back the second item you select. Pick one. My turn? Okay, so that demonstration included a normal trial and then 2 variations based on the client's responses. I will now rehearse with you as the therapist and me as the client. I may occasionally grab 2 items, so be ready to respond. Also, don't forget to collect the data. Do you have any questions?
No, I'm ready. Pick one.
Already, the supervisee has left out the first step in the procedure, providing the client with access to each item one at a time. The supervisor in this scenario is using delayed feedback. She will allow the supervisee to complete all the trials and then go back and review the supervisee's performance using the procedural checklist.
My turn. Pick one. Pick one. My turn.
Okay, great. Let's stop there and review. I'm going to look over the procedural checklist and mark all the steps that you correctly completed during the rehearsal. Can you do the same with your checklist?
The supervisor is using a self-monitoring technique to provide feedback. She is asking the supervisee to rate his own performance. This technique will allow the supervisee an opportunity to detect his own errors.
Are you finished?
Yes, but I think I forgot something when I was doing the assessment.
That's okay. Let's start by comparing our checklists and see if our observations match.
The supervisee and supervisor will compare the checklists for correspondence and non-correspondence. When they are finished, the supervisor will begin again with another demonstration of the skill.
We agree that you did not complete the first step of the assessment, which involves introducing the items to the client. All the other steps were completed. I'll provide another demonstration, and then if you'd like, we could rehearse the assessment again.
Okay, sounds good.
The supervisor will now begin another demonstration, followed by an opportunity for the supervisee to practice. Mastery criterion for this scenario is 100% correct for 3 consecutive trials. Here, the supervisee just met the mastery criterion.
My turn.
That was your 3rd consecutive practice with 100% of the steps completed correctly. We are done with the training today, but I want you to conduct an MSWO preference assessment with a student tomorrow, and I will observe. After about 3 in vivo sessions, we will put this skill on maintenance, and I will plan to observe again in a couple of weeks. How does that sound? Do you have any questions?
No, sounds good. I have just a student in mind for tomorrow's practice.
Great.
Following a few successful in vivo probes, the supervisor will put the skill on maintenance. She will check on the performance of the supervisee in about a month, and then a month or two after that to determine whether the supervisee's MSWO preference assessments continue to meet all the criteria of the procedural checklist.
So as we could see in this video, and as we have discussed throughout this presentation, the trainer provided a review of the target skill, modeled a number of times the target skill, and then provided opportunities for the trainee, or the student in this case, to perform the skill and deliver feedback contingent upon that performance. In this case, the trainer, or the person in the role of training, in the role of a trainer, delivered feedback not during implementation, however, after implementation, so during the following the observation. And of course, they use specific methods for the assessment of treatment integrity, which we'll discuss in detail in slides to come. What I will do now is I will show you another video of a slightly different application of behavioral skills training.
Behavioral skills training, or BST, is a procedure for teaching new skills. BST is a useful tool for training adult learners and is a required procedure of supervision. The four initial components of BST are as follows: introduction of the skill, skill demonstration, opportunity to practice, feedback. Skill demonstration, opportunity to practice, and feedback are repeated until mastery is observed. Here, a supervisor is introducing the skill of writing a behavioral plan to a pre-certification supervisee.
Okay, James, for today's meeting, I want to provide training for creating a data sheet. During your internship, you've come in contact with many data sheets created by others. As new behavior support plans are developed, I'd like to see you create the necessary documents for implementing those plans, and data sheets will be a big part of that.
I'm up for that.
Great. Now, when we set up this meeting, I asked you to read the Cooper, Heron, and Heward textbook, Chapter 4, Measuring Behavior. Were you able to get to that?
Yes, I brought my text and some notes.
Good. Many of the procedures described in that chapter should already be familiar with you. What content from the chapter was less familiar to you?
The supervisor introduced the skill with a textbook reading. Readings from text and journal articles are a nice way to introduce skills because they allow the supervisee to review the material prior to the training. The supervisor continues with the introduction of the skill.
Those are just some examples. Was I clear on the difference in practical applications of duration and latency recording?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The toilet training example really helped me too.
Great. Now, I have a procedural checklist for you of what I expected from the data sheet development. Let's take a moment and go over it together.
The supervisor uses the procedural checklist to introduce the steps in completing the skill. The criteria for creating a data sheet are listed down the left column, and the evaluation markings are made in the columns to the right. There is also a place for notes so that the supervisor may provide descriptive feedback.
You can keep that copy and use it as a guide when you're creating data sheets. I will also be using the procedural checklist to provide feedback on the data sheets you create.
Okay, thank you.
I have some exemplar data sheets here. These data sheets include all the criteria from the procedural checklist. There's one for each type of data collection that we will be covering. Please take a minute and review those now.
When training how to create a written document, consider providing exemplar examples as the skill demonstration.
These are great. I noticed that the momentary time sampling data sheet we use for one of the residents on my caseload is formatted differently than this example. Is it okay if I make formatting changes to these examples?
Yes, that is fine. It is the best to keep the data sheet to 1-page length, but otherwise, small changes in the formatting should be fine. Now, I would like to provide you with an opportunity to practice a skill. There's a resident on your caseload, Stephen, who has been displaying new behavior. I want you to create a momentary time sampling data sheet that the staff can use all day. Bring it by my office this afternoon, and we will go over it. How does that sound?
Sounds good. I'll work on it today and bring it by this afternoon.
Hey, James.
Hello. I'm coming by with that momentary time sampling data sheet.
Great. Do you have the procedural checklist from earlier?
Yes, I do.
I'm going to look over the data sheet that you created and see which of the criteria were included and if anything was left out. You can do the same and we can compare.
The supervisor is asking the supervisee to self-assess his data sheet using the procedural checklist.
Did you have an opportunity to mark a rating for all the criteria?
Yes.
Now we will compare our ratings to see where we agree and where we differ. We both agree the instructions for collecting data were omitted.
Yeah, I forgot those.
Otherwise, it looks like we agree that all of the other criteria were included. I would like to continue to give you opportunities to practice creating forms for data collection.
Okay, that was fun, so I don't mind making some more.
When you've created 3 different data collection sheets with 100% of the criteria met on procedural checklist, we will move on to the in vivo generalization probes. For the in vivo generalization probes, you will find your own opportunities to create data sheets for the residents on your caseload. I will check in to look them over as they are created.
Following a few successful in vivo probes, the supervisor will put the skill on maintenance. She will continue to check on the data sheets created by the supervisee in about a month, and then about a month or 2 after that to determine whether the supervisee's data sheets continue to meet all the criteria of the procedural checklist.
So in this specific example, of course, with some additional components, it was also modeled a different way to, not a different way, but basically the implementation of behavioral skills training with a different skill or target skill. One thing that I wanted to mention was that again, it is a procedure that is scripted, that in order to implement correctly, it is, as I already mentioned, recommended to use some kind of a storyboard or guidance. But something that's critical, and I hope that you actually got it from the video, was that implementation of the specific target skill occurs following, or like implementation of the actual target skill in vivo with the actual clients usually occurs or should occur following reaching some predetermined criterion for mastery. So that is an important consideration when implementing BST. So of course, I mean, has been a variety of ways in which BST has been implemented, but of course, when looking at the correct implementation, there should be training that occurs prior actual implementation with the actual client until a specific criterion has been reached. So to make this point very clear, and this would be our 3rd point in this presentation, other than, in addition to, the use of, the ineffective or the overuse of didactic training, which is mainly the form of training for repair educators, or the mainly used strategy to train our repair educators, and of course the inclusion of performance feedback in any training intervention. The use of behavioral skills training is also critical. Critical in that it is focused on skill development. It provides, or it uses a combination of variety of strategies, antecedent-based and consequence-based strategies. It is an evidence-based approach to training paraeducators to implement a variety of skills in the special education classroom. So it is certainly a training strategy that must be given consideration when selecting training strategies and interventions for our paraeducators in the actual classroom. So as effective as behavioral skills training is, there is also, or we can also continue to combine training strategies to make our training or increase the strength of our training interventions. For instance, the combination of, or the further combination of antecedent and consequence-based strategies, such as didactic training and skills training, you know, of course, with a component of follow-up training or on-the-job training. This is usually the case, or this can actually happen in consultation efforts, continued training, or technical assistance. So for instance, our patent intensive skills training are examples of combined training strategies or training strategies that combine didactic training or components of didactic training as well as skills training. Didactic training for the development and acquisition of concepts, as well as the skills training to practice the specific skills that are relevant associated with those concepts. Research has also evaluated the effect of this more comprehensive training approaches with paraeducators supporting students with ASD. So for instance, Walker and Snell in 2017 effectively trained paraeducators supporting students with ASD to implement function-based interventions. What the authors found in this study was an increase in the overall percentage of function-based strategies implemented. All participants, in this study actually implemented those function-based interventions to 100% implementation fidelity. What were some of the training components, which, we're getting to the details and the importance. Didactic training, which occurred for about an hour, and then BST, behavioral skills training, which lasted on an average of 8 training sessions to mastery. Similarly, Bolton and Mayer in 2008 effectively trained paraeducators in school settings, and of course, paraeducators supporting students with ASD to implement discrete trial training. After training, paraeducators participants were able to implement discrete trial steps with 100% accuracy. What were some of the training components? Didactic training, which lasted about 45 minutes. Behavioral skills training, which lasted about 2 hours and 15 minutes, with total training time of 3 hours within a training day. Of course, there was subsequent training that occurred on once discrete trial steps were mastered in order to maintain the skill. Coaching and feedback occurred over subsequent sessions. So of course, in all cases, the purpose of training should aim at improving what paraeducators do in the classroom when supporting students with ASD. Specifically increase, as we have been mentioning throughout this presentation, increase treatment fidelity of targeted interventions. But what exactly is treatment fidelity? What is it that we're measuring when we're assessing or evaluating or measuring treatment fidelity? Well, first of all, treatment fidelity is the extent to which an intervention is actually delivered as intended or planned. It is a very important methodological concern in research and practice. It is essential to make it valid conclusions regarding training outcomes or intervention effectiveness. Sadly, it is usually assumed rather than assessed. So we make assumptions based on implementations, however, without taking close look at details of implementation that may actually differentiate what good implementation or correct implementation is from incorrect implementation. When we're looking at the assessment of treatment fidelity, we're basically looking at specific dimensions that are being assessed. Dimensions which mean specific aspects of implementation. For example, adherence is one, or content. What intervention steps were delivered correctly. Quantity, how much of the intervention was provided. Quality, how well the intervention steps were delivered, and process, how the intervention overall was delivered. So in your opinion, What do you think is the most commonly dimension of, the most commonly assessed dimension of treatment fidelity? So please take a second to consider this. In your opinion, what is the most commonly assessed dimension of treatment fidelity? And the answer is treatment adherence. Most of treatment fidelity assessment focuses on the assessment of what steps were implemented correctly, or the extent to steps being implemented, which when evaluating the overall effectiveness of an intervention, only providing feedback, supportive or corrective feedback and training on the extent to what steps were implemented correctly may not really capture implementation in a comprehensive manner, because we're leaving out aspects such as the quantity of the intervention, how much, or dosage, how much of the intervention should we have actually delivered, or the quality of the process. There may be some qualitative aspects of the intervention that actually matter. And of course, whether the process was completed overall as intended. So for example, this is an example of a treatment or procedural fidelity checklist. Usually what happens when assessing treatment fidelity is, as you could see in the videos, the trainer or the teacher or the person in a training role would actually observe implementation, and as implementation actually occurs, or instructional behavior actually occurs, this form is actually completed, So then towards the end, it allows for feedback being delivered based on specific implementation. This is just simply another example. For example, this previous one was an example of a specific instructional delivery or delivery of discrete trials. This one is on the implementation of a specific behavioral procedure, in this case, escape extinction. This one is a specific treatment fidelity or treatment integrity checklist on man training procedures, or on the delivery of man training procedures. So the advantage of assessing treatment fidelity is that it allows us to really, it should allow us to really account for comprehension for all possible components of implementation that may actually affect specific performances. Actually, also, employing these specific checklists as a form of feedback would actually reduce, would take actually the emotion out of feedback delivery. So it would be objective in a way that we would be delivering feedback based on specific performance and specific behaviors that have been already operationally defined, rather than taking into our feedback or including our feedback emotional responses regarding implementation. As important as it is to evaluate the fidelity of our peer educators or of our trainees, it is also important to evaluate the fidelity of the trainer. I myself as a trainer, as a teacher, am I correct in my implementation of the specific procedures? Am I competent enough in my implementation of specific target behavior so that I can actually train others to implement this specific skill and give them feedback on those specific skills? So training intervention should also evaluate, monitor the extent to which the trainer or professionals in position of training is delivering the training as intended. It's usually done by a second or more observers. In some cases, the evaluating teacher or the supervising special education teacher, and maybe another professional competent in the performance of the target behavior or target skill. This is just simply an example of what a treatment fidelity checklist would be for not the trainees or the paraeducator implement target behaviors, but for the trainers training behaviors. So basically what we have seen so far is that the main method of training of our paraeducators is something that could be considered, it's a strategy that has shown to be not effective, as is the case of didactic training, since it doesn't focus on the development of skills or the acquisition of skills, rather it does focus on simply information being provided to develop concepts. Performance feedback, of course, being a critical component in professional development, which must be included in training interventions for our paraeducators, and of course using training strategies that focus on, that are competency-based, performance and competency-based, such as behavioral skills training, or combination of antecedent and consequent strategies that really strengthen the power of our training interventions, such as didactic training plus skills training and such. But there is a problem. We know that these multi-component training approaches are effective, given that they're comprehensive. They account for concept development as well as skills training and developing relevant skills that are necessary for our paraeducators in classrooms. However, as we could see also by the results in the research that has evaluated these specific interventions, and of course, these interventions may be needed in order to obtain optimal results when training our paraeducators in classrooms. Of course, we know that we're gonna, by implementing these specific strategies, we know that we're gonna perhaps obtain optimal results. We're gonna reach optimal levels of implementation fidelity. However, the nature or the multi-component nature of these strategies also may require increased resources, technology, staff, increased amount of time, as we could see in the research that has evaluated these strategies. Training lasted 3 hours over the course of days, which is a need for consideration, and also the relevance of the content provided. In all, considering the reality in special education classrooms, ratios, of course, dealing with just naturally occurring situations or contingencies established in special education classrooms, implementation of these kinds of training strategies may actually compromise the feasibility of training that happens for paraeducators in the actual classrooms. Again, we're saying they are effective. However, they may involve increased time, resources that may actually compromise the training that should happen in classrooms. So the need for the identification of practical, time-efficient, and equally effective training methods for training paraeducators in classrooms, it's needed. It's something that us, those of us in positions of training need to constantly evaluate. And of course, any teacher in a classroom perhaps would not tell me that their classroom dynamics are perfect, where these kinds of comprehensive multi-component training strategies can be implemented with the level of consistency needed to establish and maintain the specific target behaviors. We know that, realities in special education classrooms, as I mentioned, with ratios, responsibilities of teachers, make these kinds of training, though effective, very difficult to implement sometimes in classrooms with the frequency that we would actually desire. So there has been some research that has evaluated what we would call abbreviated training strategies or brief feedback-based strategies. So some of these strategies have been effective at training paraeducators, supporting students with autism in actual special education classrooms. So for instance, feedback alone, or combination of feedback methods. What the research has suggested is that, which we'll probably address a little bit later, is that perhaps feedback alone has the least impact in skill development. However, the combination of feedback strategies may actually increase fidelity of implementation to optimal levels. So feedback alone or combination of feedback methods is something that has been evaluated with a degree of effectiveness. Modeling plus feedback is also something that has been evaluated successfully. Video modeling and feedback, as well as skill rehearsal and feedback. For instance, LeBlanc used a combination of feedback models in order to train paraeducators implementing discrete child training. Over the course of the training and within a short amount of time, paraeducators reach implementation fidelity or mastery criteria when delivering discrete child training for students with ASD. Robinson in 2011 also used an abbreviated method for training paraeducators, which consisted of modeling and performance feedback when training paraeducators to implement procedures to teach social skills for students with autism. Gilligan and colleagues also employed skill rehearsal and feedback successfully to train paraeducators to deliver discrete child instruction to individuals with autism. Across these studies, the length of training, of course, this training was done over the course of a few days, on average 3 to 4 days to reach mastery criteria, and the training length ranged from 10 to 20 minutes. So some of the work that I've done in terms of evaluating this idea of brief or abbreviated training strategies, some of my research work, it's aimed at training paraeducators supporting students with ASD using this specific abbreviated strategy. So so the results of this paper are yet unpublished. However, they provide some evidence of effectiveness of these specific procedures or specific training strategies. For instance, in this specific study, the purpose was to train paraeducators using a feedback-based procedure or strategy, which included performance feedback, vocal verbal, and a component of skill rehearsal for incorrectly performed skills when training paraeducators to conduct manual training for students with ASD in the actual special education classroom. So 4 paraeducators participated in this specific study. The paraeducators age range from 22 years of age to 63 years of age. And of course, they did not have any prior training in the application of MAN training, the formal application of MAN training, and or interventions that derive from applied behavior analysis or the analysis of verbal behavior. The setting was a school, was a private school and a local public school, elementary school. Specifically, what we measured was the number of correct MAN sequences taught in 10 minutes, as well as the percentage of correct MAN steps correctly implemented. So the reason why we decided to actually evaluate these 2 measures is because correct implementation or high levels of implementation fidelity or percentage of correct implementation may mean that the person is also not teaching one specific target skill correct. So high levels of implementation fidelity may indicate that no skill is actually being trained correctly. 80% implementation fidelity may mean that I implemented 4 out of 5 steps correctly. However, maybe that one step that was missed, it's a critical component of implementation, though not really teaching a specific target skill in the appropriate manner or correctly. The intervention, as I already mentioned, was feedback alone plus corrective feedback and a component of skill rehearsal, which was only implemented for target behaviors or sequences implemented correctly. Feedback in this specific case was scripted so that all participants received the same kind of feedback, of course, independent or individualized to their specific performance. And the reason why feedback was scripted, or we decided to make feedback scripted, was so that qualitative components of feedback may not impact or influence specific performances. Feedback was procedure-based and it was immediately following the observation. No modeling or instructions were actually used as components of the intervention. Only skill rehearsal, performance feedback mainly, and skill rehearsal. So as we can see here, this is the number of correct MAN sequences taught per educator. So for example, what we can see is the number of correct NAND sequences taught at baseline at 0, somewhat relatively high number of incorrect sequences across participants. So there was no participant that actually implemented a single correct sequence during baseline. And of course, we use a multiple baseline across participants. But immediately following implementation, we notice an increase, of course, across participants in correct implementation. And this was done across participants. So what we're getting at here is that there was a drastic change in level from baseline to intervention to the first implementation of the intervention following only one implementation of the training. So this could speak of the powerful nature of this specific training intervention for this specific target skill. And this was observed across participants, as I already mentioned. So in this case, we're seeing, which is probably a little more reflective, it's easier to see. What we're seeing here is the percentage of correct NAND steps correctly implemented. So again, across participants, there is a rapid change in level from baseline to intervention following the first implementation of the training. And in most cases, of course, training reached mastery criteria within 5 to 6 sessions. Only in the case of the first participant, which actually training lasted for 11 sessions. Now, another component to take into account, which may speak of the powerful nature of this kind of intervention and the effectiveness of it, is that post-training, during follow-up, participants really maintain higher, really high levels of implementation fidelity, with only participant 1, Barb, showing a slight decrease in implementation fidelity. I believe it was from 100% or 99% to 91%. All other participants maintain optimal levels of implementation fidelity at the 2 follow-ups, during the 2 follow-up sessions. So again, post-training, all of our participants were able to maintain optimal, high levels of implementation fidelity. Now, something important also to consider here is that, data was only collected for 2 or 3 times per day. So if data was actually collected for multiple other days, or more days, we could have probably seen more rapid increases or more rapid mastery of the target skill, or mastery criteria would have been reached much quicker. So not only we saw effective implementation, optimal levels of implementation fidelity, during training and post-training, but also training time was actually a significant factor. On average, training sessions lasted across participants 4 minutes and 35 sessions, with a range of 1 minute to 9 minutes of training. The average of sessions to reach mastery actually was 6, between 5 and 11, which I already mentioned. So what does this mean? This means that there is a training intervention that it's perhaps less comprehensive, less rigorous, but it's equally effective, and even suggested to be time efficient, because it requires really a minimal time commitment, which can be implemented with ease in the context of a natural setting. It could be something that could be actually implemented in the context of a classroom or in the context of the classroom routine, It was something that followed specific performances. And of course, in this specific case, feedback was delivered following the session so that we would not have to deal with potential issues such as observer reactivity. The results suggest that this appeared an efficient and equally effective intervention as any other more comprehensive method. So we got the same results, basically, using less time to train and perhaps focusing on the most relevant components of the training intervention, which was performance feedback and skill rehearsal. So to mention again, the importance of this training approach in regards to the minimal time commitment, not only as suggestive of efficiency, and also, as mentioned already, the ease of implementation of procedures that could be easily integrated into the classroom dynamic. The minimal time commitment that it requires also can strengthen the idea that teachers, actual special education teachers, could actually provide this kind of training on a consistent basis so that the skills trained to paraeducators can be trained to acquisition, but also monitored for maintenance. So that brings us to our fourth point, which, of course, as mentioned, you know, if we have the time and resources, of course, we should always consider trying to implement research-based strategies that are comprehensive, that are probably going to be needed to reach optimal levels of implementation. However, when those may compromise the feasibility of training of our paraeducators in actual classrooms and relevant to the skills that are related to the skills that are relevant to their practice, we must consider alternative options for training that are going to be equally effective, equally or more time efficient, so that the training of our paraeducators in classrooms does not get compromised. So to further explore the effectiveness and efficiency of these abbreviated training approaches or strategies, we conducted a study, a comparative study, with the attempt, of course, as I mentioned, to assess the effectiveness and efficiency of an abbreviated training method. Specifically, in this case, we compared this brief performance feedback intervention, which composed of performance feedback, vocal, verbal, and skill rehearsal, with the actual implementation of BSD when training paraeducators supporting students with ASD in special education classroom to implement errorless teaching procedures when teaching verbal skills. And of course, this is currently an unpublished dissertation. So participants were 3 paraeducators. The age range of our paraeducators was between 19 years of age and 58 years of age. The setting was a private school and a charter school, a local charter school. Similarly, as in the case of the previous study presented, we evaluated the frequency of correct and incorrect errorless teaching sequences taught during a specific training sessions implemented by paraeducators, as well as the percentage of errorless teaching sequence steps correctly implemented. In both cases, observation occurred via live observation, direct observation, trial by trial, and tally counts were used as preferred methods for data collection. And similarly, as in the case of our previous study, data was collected between 2 to 3, only 2 to 3 days per week. So specifically what we evaluated or what we compared was a brief performance feedback intervention again, which was implemented post-session, which consisted of vocal verbal feedback with a component of skill rehearsal for incorrectly performed skills within sequences. And in this specific case, we also use an intervention script. So we use scripted feedback for the same reasons, in order to make sure that all participants were receiving the same kind of feedback, so that qualitative aspects of feedback delivery would not influence performance. This abbreviated training strategy was also compared to behavioral skills training. So behavioral skills training specifically was delivered pre-session or before the intervention. Specific components employed included instructions, modeling, rehearsal, and feedback. Performance criterion requirement was established prior implementation with students. And as a control measure, we also compared the effectiveness of simply typed instructions, which were delivered pre-session. And this was a document which specific behavioral definitions of each of the steps in each of the errorless teaching sequences. And again, this specific strategy was used as a control measure in our study. There was counterbalancing due to design recommendations. The design that we used was an adapted alternating treatments design, which allowed us to compare non-reversible behaviors or training interventions. So specifically, participant 1 was teaching using the abbreviated training strategy, a specific target verbal skill, listener responses. BST was trained teaching to teach tagged pictures using BST, and introverbals using controls or typed instruction. So these were all counterbalanced across participants in order to make sure that no one skill was actually better performed due to other confound factor. We also followed some specific training as a schedule for intervention delivery, and this was just simply to make sure that, just to increase, quality aspects of the study, to make sure that that treatment interference would not influence specific components or aspects of implementation, or that the delivery of one specific training would actually influence implementation of another one. At least a 30-minute period elapsed between training deliveries, and this was due to just simply classroom schedules, student schedules, availability of the participants during the day. Of course, ideally, what we would have liked is to have more time in between training deliveries. However, 30 minutes appeared to be sufficient not to exert any influence on the following training. As baseline, there was no training being provided. Participants were provided with specific targets for implementation across target skills. Following that, participants were asked to begin the session. We began timing the session, and then data collection occurred as implementation of procedures also occurred. Of errorless procedures across target variable skills actually occurred. And at the end of the session, we thanked the participant for their time and reminded them of the following training session. So during BPF, basically, pre-training procedures were as in baseline. So once we reach the training termination, the participant would, that's where the BPF, or the abbreviated training session, would actually start, which consisted, again, of the provision of supportive feedback and praise for steps correctly implemented, as well as corrective feedback, which included a component of evaluation and description of how to perform the skill correctly for incorrectly performed target skills. Following the feedback delivery, the participant was provided with a couple of opportunities to practice the skill, which was also followed by performance feedback. And following correct implementation of the training, the correct implementation of the participant of the target skill, we would end the timer, and the training session would have actually ended. For BST, it was pre-session, as mentioned. So timer began when the participant was actually provided with instructions for them to review. Following review, we actually reviewed those specific set of definitions and steps with the participant, with the paraeducator. Following review and opportunities for ask questions regarding those specific definitions, modeling began. So there were 3 models, 3 opportunities for modeling. Following 3 opportunities for modeling, or three modeling opportunities, Then the participant was given the opportunity to practice the skill with feedback until training criterion was mastered, was reached, which was 3 consecutive implementation of the target behavior during training without any errors. So 100% implementation fidelity. Following the training, the participant was asked to begin the session, and during the session, baseline procedures were in place where data collection took place, and following the session, no training actually occurred, no feedback was actually provided following implementation of procedures, following the training, following the observation. And for typed instructions, which was used, as I mentioned, as a control condition for a study, participant was provided instructions with clear definitions of target behaviors across target skills. Immediately following the participant reading instructions, the session began, and baseline procedures were in place where we collected data, and following the intervention or following the observation, the participant was thanked for their time and reminded of the next session. No feedback nor training was provided following the session. So the main difference here between the comparison of the 2 specific training strategies evaluated was that one was provided following the observation, brief performance feedback, and one was actually provided before the observation, such as, as in the case of behavioral skills training. And of course, following the specific training components of each. Follow-up, it was conducted following participants reach training termination. And that was done for 5 consecutive weeks following training termination. And of course, baseline procedures were in place. So what we're seeing here is, of course, across target skills, no target skills were actually correct during baseline. And of course, a lot of incorrect skills being across target behaviors, of course, being implemented during baseline. Now, of course, following consistent baseline on the frequency of correct and incorrect errorless teaching sequences, this is what we need to start tuning in. So here, the open circles means correct implementation of PPF for this participant, and the closed squares, correct implementation of BST. In both cases, so specifically in this case, BST appeared to have BPF appeared to have a more rapid change in level between baseline and intervention. And of course, what we really want to tune in here is the differentiation between the data paths or the patterns between the open circles and the closed squares, which appears to be minimal, during the intervention phase, which may indicate that for this specific participant, the skills training under BPF and the skills training under BST had, some relatively similar effects, as far as implementation. Over follow-up, again, we are maintaining, or what we are seeing is similar levels of implementation, where participants really did not decrease in the rate of errorless teaching sequences performed. So what really is indicative for BST and BPF, maintain a somewhat high level of correct number of sequences implemented for the skill trained under BPF and the skill trained under BST. So it's very similar levels of effect. As far as the percentage of correct steps implemented for participant 1, we're basically seeing the same effects, whereas BPF, appeared to have a greater effect after first implementation. BST also showing a really quick change in level from baseline or intervention, and levels of implementation appear to be pretty high in those 2 conditions. And of course, control condition remained at mid to low levels, never reaching optimal levels of implementation, which is indicative that, of course, there is not interfere or confound in the evaluation of these specific strategies. For participant 2, which may look a little more, a little noisier, but still we're seeing the same effect as opposed to the first participant. And participant with participant 2, we see that BST actually has a greater effect following first implementation. But again, what we see is that there is a consistent increasing pattern in the number of errorless teaching sequences taught for both BPF and BST. And during follow-up, of course, we're seeing similar levels of implementation. So there are some overlapping points which indicate that the functional relation is actually established, as there are not really great difference between levels of performance for skills trained under BST or skills training under BPF. So I think this is better exemplified in this graph, which is a little cleaner. But what we're seeing is exactly that, consistent baseline, and where BST actually shows, which is actually the little x's, the x's, shows a more rapid or more drastic improvements after first implementation. But again, after a few sessions, levels of implementation actually overlap, which were optimal for both training interventions. During follow-up, skills trained under BPF and BST really maintain optimal levels of implementation. For participant 3, what we're seeing here is a similar effect, whereas BST had a greater impact following first implementation of the training, but with BPF also showing high levels of implementation just after an additional training session until they reach mastery criteria. And as we can see, there is a clearly established functional relationship between BPF and BST, and of course our target behaviors, in that there is not a lot of difference in patterns of responding. Over follow-up, post-training termination, we continue to see the same data pattern or the same pattern of performance. That is the results for the percentage of correct steps implemented in our 10-minute session with respect to participant 3. As mentioned, a greater effect of BST after initial training and BPF reaching almost optimal levels of implementation after an additional training session, and then quickly reaching mastery criteria, and the skills being maintained over our 5 consecutive weeks of follow-up. So as the functional relation was actually established between BST and BPF, in that they both reach optimal levels of implementation with really minor differences in performance patterns between, across the participants, an evaluation of course time efficiency was also conducted. And what we see here is that basically implementation of BST took 3 times the amount of time that actually BPF took. So we're seeing, again, as in the case of the previous study, optimal levels of implementation or high levels of implementation, correct implementation with less training time. So for example, for our participant 1, mean session duration was 3 minutes and 34 seconds for BPF, and BST was 11 minutes. Merit for participant 2, 4 minutes and a half, about 12 minutes for BST, and for participant 3, about 3 minutes and a half and almost 10 and a half minutes for BST. Total training time included in this training was, for BPF was almost 15 minutes for participant 1, 6.5 minutes for participant 2 and 17 minutes for participant 3, whereas BST was 43, almost 43 minutes, over an hour for participant 2, and almost 50 minutes, approximately 50 minutes for participant 3. So there is a clear difference here in terms of the amount of, not only the training, the within training session duration, but also the amount of total training time to reach mastery criteria, which really indicates clear differences between one training strategy, abbreviated brief performance feedback, and behavioral skills training. So what are some key takeaways from this study? Number one, that of course both interventions showed to be effective, bringing the behavior of instructional behavior of peer educators, participants to optimal levels of implementation fidelity, or to optimal levels, reaching mastery criteria in relatively similar amounts of time. Perhaps VST, of course, is a better option when you have shorter time in days, or less days, but more times in sessions or in training sessions. Whereas BPF, you have more time, or more days to train, but less time within sessions. So this idea of more days and perhaps less time may be better suited for what really happens, or what could happen in special education classrooms, where teachers or others in position of training may have more days to train, but really the amount of time that they need to train, or they have to train within specific training sessions, is more limited. Another important component not to dismiss regarding training effectiveness is the acceptability of the training by those receiving the training, So peer educator observations and acceptance of observations are essential ingredients in successful training programs. So we must ensure really that staff are familiar with the process used to monitor their performance. Informing peer educators in advance exactly when the observation and the training will be conducted. The nature of feedback, quality and immediacy of the feedback is also very important, and providing a brief written summary of the feedback in addition to spoken feedback, just in case it is worth it, it's important for them to, or have a place for them to, for them in case they want to go back and review the information provided. Making sure that when observing, you're being nice, pleasant, unobtrusive, and discontinue the observation without training when, specifically when, atypical situations actually occur. If training procedures are effective, but they're not acceptable by the team, likely what's going to happen is that they may actually impact the overall implementation fidelity or performance over time, which really brings us to our fifth point. In addition to knowing that currently perhaps our peer educators are being trained with not so effective methods, considering the fact that performance feedback is a component that it's critical in any training model or training program, that of course, if time and resources are available, we want to use evidence-based training that includes components such as, or training strategies or training approaches such as BST, which include a combination of antecedent and consequence-based strategies that focus on the acquisition of skills. And of course, if those implementation of those trainings in classrooms, specifically in classrooms, pose some limitation or may compromise the training of our para-educators, we must attempt to evaluate alternative training methods that may be equally effective but more efficient in time. In addition to this, of course, we have to make sure that the training that's being provided is actually acceptable by our para-educators. So what are some final considerations respect to this presentation and specifically this topic? Considering the use of brief training methods, of course, because they may be likely to increase the efficiency and still be effective when training a variety of skills to paraeducators. Of course, I mean, they provide with the opportunity to be delivered with consistency, since it does not really require an extensive amount of time or extensive amount of time. Of course, if resources are available, staff and time are not really of concern, you know, the recommendation is to use, you know, what's already validated, that has more empirical support, and of course it's needed to reach optimal levels of implementation. So that would be number one, because, you know, not dismissing the idea of using alternative methods, consider it, especially if more comprehensive training strategies may actually pose limitation or decrease the feasibility, compromise the feasibility of training of our paraeducators in classrooms. It must be scheduled, you know, and make it ongoing. So so teachers and those in positions of training must actually work towards developing a system of training where training occurs on a consistent basis. If training is not scheduled, it is unlikely to happen, you know? So you have to make sure that you make it known for yourself and for your teams, teachers, that training is actually gonna occur. It doesn't happen, it doesn't need to happen every day. It could actually happen 2 to 3 times per week. And the time intervals do not have to be really extensive or like extends in time. It could just be 10, 15 minutes or even less, you know, where you're actually focused on the development of a specific target skills and providing feedback that is procedure-based to address those specific skills. Make it data-based. Focus on treatment fidelity, you know, a variety of skills that are relevant for implementation of paraeducators. Collect data on those, you know, and monitor performance post-training termination. That is critical. Focus on variety of skills, account for different dimensions when giving feedback, so that way we can account for the implementation of the intervention in a more comprehensive manner. Make sure that when delivering your feedback, of course, you're including components of evaluation and description. And, you know, perhaps leaning more towards the descriptive part, you know, so that you're focusing more on providing the information necessary to improve performance rather than criticism on the participants or the paraeducator's performance. In addition to that, follow your feedback with an opportunity to actually practice the skills, so that supportive feedback, positive or other forms of positive reinforcement could actually be provided or delivered. Immediate performance feedback following implementation. If you wait too long, it may actually not impact implementation in the way that you intend. Try to make it as soon as the observation is actually finished. Use a variety of methods, vocal, graphical, which has suggested some level of effectiveness. Seeing a graph with increasing performance can actually be as reinforcing as receiving social praise, including your feedback student outcomes as well, which, you know, we should be reinforced by the skill acquisition of our students. That could actually even be a more powerful reinforcer. Be sincere and objective. Make your feedback data-based. Remove emotion. Keep in check your ratio of positive and negatives. Sometimes, you know, your feedback can actually come from those specific behavioral definitions or procedural checklists. So that way you're giving feedback that is really aligned to the specific procedures to be implemented. And of course, be sincere, you know, care about your paraeducators when providing training. Inform your paraeducators who will be trained, who will you be training and when. And of course, continuously evaluate your training with data. Monitor paraeducator performance over time. Flat lines may be indicative of your training procedures. So you are actually responding to the data. Data should actually serve as a discriminative stimulus for instructional behavior. In this case, the instructional behavior of the trainer. You know, if data is showing that your participants are not making, or your paraeducators are not making the progress intended or the progress desired, well, maybe there is something to change in our training procedures. Use differential reinforcement. Select behaviors you want to reinforce and deliver it when those actually occur. We have the power of reinforcing behaviors that we want to see increase. Catch your pair as being good. Let them know that they are doing well. They will really appreciate it. As mentioned, of course, use comprehensive training approaches if resources are available on a consistent basis. If not, evaluate training, alternative training strategies in order to focus on the efficiency and also the effectiveness of training. And finally, considering the minimal time commitment that these kinds of trainings may actually require, the training for paraeducators might actually be conducted in the actual classroom, or in a relevant setting and be delivered on a consistent basis by the supervising a special education teacher. Considering the nature of the responsibilities of special education teachers, it would be most ideal if they are the ones who are actually in the position of training and also are going to be the ones who are going to be best at evaluating the maintenance of certain skills that, in terms of paraeducator skill acquisition. So they are going to be the ones who are going to be best monitor the acquisition and maintenance of skills of our paraeducators. So that brings us to the end of our presentation, or of this presentation. I hope that it provided some information that it's relevant to your practices, and I really thank you for your attention, and I hope that you guys enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.